An emperor's own hair proved someone poisoned him, 2,400 times the normal dose of arsenic, concentrated in the exact strands that grew during the final days of his life. A skeleton, twisted and deformed, quietly destroyed a 400-year-old insult against a man history called lazy. A woman dead for 21 centuries came out of the ground with soft skin, bendable joints, and 138 melon seeds still sitting undigested in her stomach. And a queen that scholars assumed was myth turned up in a flooded pit, buried with the exact battle axe the ancient bones said she carried into war. 4 tombs, 4 verdicts history had already closed. All 4 reopened by science, and every single time, the truth turned out to be stranger than the legend nobody bothered checking twice. This all starts with an explosion. July 1928, a warlord named Sun Dianying packs dynamite against the sealed doors of an empress's tomb and lights the fuse. China, at this moment, has no emperor. The dynasty collapsed in 1912. The country has splintered into rival warlord territories, and the soldiers who once guarded the imperial tombs have long since scattered and gone home. Sun marches his unpaid army into the valley, seals the area off under the cover of military exercises, and when the stone doors of Empress Dowager Cixi's tomb refuse to budge, his men bring up explosives instead. That single act of looting is the reason any of the next 100 years of discovery was even possible, because in China, digging up an emperor on purpose has been almost unthinkable for centuries. Everything that follows in this story only happened because thieves, accidents, and desperate wartime digging broke the seal first, and scientists simply arrived after the door was already open, picking through what violence and chaos had already exposed. Start with the hair. Beijing, spring 2008. A single strand, 10 inches long, sits inside a sealed sample bag on a laboratory bench, about to be blasted with neutrons in a technique called neutron activation analysis, a method sensitive enough to detect trace elements inside a single human hair without destroying the sample itself. This exact procedure was once used to test the remains of Napoleon. This time, the hair belonged to the Guangxu Emperor, the second to last ruler of China, dead since November 1908 at the age of 37. Official court records said natural illness. Rumors said otherwise, and those rumors survived for exactly 100 years without a shred of physical proof either way. The project that finally tested them had been quietly running for 5 years, bringing together an unlikely alliance. Historians from the National Committee for the Compilation of Qing History, physicists from the China Institute of Atomic Energy, forensic specialists from the Beijing police, and a state television documentary crew, all working toward the same approaching deadline, the 100th anniversary of a death nobody had ever properly investigated. The neutron scan ended the century-old argument in a single sentence. Arsenic levels along that hair spiked to roughly 2,400 times the normal amount, concentrated entirely in the segments that had grown during his final days alive. Researchers compared the sample against hair taken from the Empress, buried beside him, specifically to rule out contamination from the tomb environment itself, and the pattern didn't match at all. They compared it against known cases of slow chronic arsenic exposure, the kind that could come from years of traditional medicine, and that didn't match either. The poison hadn't built up gradually over a lifetime. It arrived all at once, in a single catastrophic dose. Total arsenic recovered from his hair, his clothing, and the surrounding remains came to just over 200 milligrams. A lethal dose in a grown adult starts at around 60 milligrams. This wasn't years of bad luck or bad medicine. It was murder, and the laboratory proved it a full century after the body went cold. Here's the question that should stop you cold before you even get to who did it. How did scientists in 2008 get access to an emperor's hair, his clothing, and his physical remains at all? Chinese emperors were sealed inside underground stone palaces, specifically so that no human hand would ever touch them again. The honest answer isn't comforting. In 1938, with Japan invading China and the country collapsing into war, unidentified soldiers tunneled quietly into the emperor's tomb at night, bypassing the sealed main entrance entirely, cut a narrow hole directly into the side of his coffin, pulled the gold and jewels out through it, and vanished without ever being identified or caught. They left the body untouched. That specific robbery, decades before any scientist arrived, is the only reason a laboratory in 2008 had a single hair to test in the first place. Empress Dowager Cixi placed him on the throne at the age of 4, specifically so she could continue ruling from behind him, and when he grew into an adult and actually tried to govern, launching a sudden burst of modernizing reforms in 1898, aimed at overhauling China's schools, army, and government, she crushed the entire movement within weeks, executed 6 of its leading reformers, and confined him to a walled island palace for the final 10 years of his life. His favorite companion, a young consort remembered as the Pearl Concubine, who had encouraged those very reforms, ended up dead inside a well in the Forbidden City in 1900, and palace staff accounts from the time say Cixi ordered her thrown in personally. By the autumn of 1908, Cixi was in her 70s and visibly gravely ill, and everyone at court understood the brutal arithmetic hanging over the palace. If she died even a single week before him, the prisoner instantly becomes the most powerful man in China again, free to resurrect every reform he'd been stopped from making, and to settle every score from a decade earlier. That did not happen. He died on November 14th. She died roughly 22 hours later. With whatever strength she had left, she used her final hours alive to install a 2-year-old boy on the throne instead, guaranteeing that no grown, capable emperor would ever again threaten the legacy she'd spent a lifetime building. The laboratory could not prove beyond any argument exactly whose hand gave the order, but it proved beyond any reasonable doubt at all that someone did, and that the coincidence historians had quietly accepted for 100 years was never a coincidence to begin with. Second tomb, and this one science opened on purpose rather than stumbling into by accident, and what it found took a 400-year-old insult and buried it for good. The setting is a Ming Dynasty valley north of Beijing, where 13 emperors lie beneath their own artificial hills, and the year is 1957. Archaeologists spent a full year hunting for the deliberately hidden entrance to the tomb of the Wanli Emperor, sealed since 1620, following nothing but a stroke of luck and a small carved stone tablet, left behind centuries earlier by the original builders, giving exact measured directions back to their own hidden door. Behind 3 centuries of total silence wait 3 enormous coffins. The largest holds Wanli himself, the emperor who ruled longer than any other Ming ruler in history, 48 years on the throne, and then for the final 3 decades of that reign, simply stopped functioning as emperor at all. Ministers submitted formal reports that went unanswered for years. Government posts sat vacant because no one would approve new appointments. Grand secretaries begged in writing for a single audience, and grew old waiting for one that never came. History's verdict on him was total and unforgiving, a lazy man who let an empire quietly rot from the inside while he hid from his own job. Then the specialists actually examined the bones, and the verdict started falling apart. Wanli's skeleton wasn't lying straight in the formal, dignified posture expected of an imperial burial. His legs were unequal in length, one visibly contracted, consistent with a severe, long-standing disease of the bones or joints. This was a man who, in life, may genuinely not have been able to walk without assistance from someone else. And in 1958, laboratory tests run on his remains found morphine residues at high levels throughout his bones, meaning years of habitual heavy opium use, not occasional indulgence, chronic dependence. Suddenly, his own old written complaints of dizziness and pain, dismissed for centuries as the excuses of a malingerer, read like the plain, unembellished truth instead. The lazy emperor, once you actually look at his skeleton, becomes a disabled man living in chronic pain, self-medicating with the strongest drug available anywhere at his own court, sinking further and further from public life as the addiction deepens its grip. The old question historians asked was why one man chose idleness. The new question, the one his bones actually raised, is what happens to an empire built entirely around a single all-powerful ruler when that ruler becomes physically disabled, addicted, and in constant pain, with no constitutional mechanism anywhere in the system to work around him. There's a second, quieter story buried inside that same chamber, and it belongs to the smallest of the 3 coffins. That coffin held a former palace maid named Lady Wang, a servant who caught the young emperor's attention decades earlier, bore him his first son, and was punished for the rest of her life because of it, exiled to a distant palace, ignored, denied any honors, kept from her own child for years at a stretch as Wanli fought a 15-year political war with his own officials, over which son should actually inherit the throne. Her health broke, her eyesight failed. She died in 1611, and Wanli gave her a funeral so minimal that his own court officials formally protested on her behalf. 9 years later, in a single chaotic autumn when the palace burned through 3 different emperors, her own grandson finally took the throne, and one of his very first acts was to posthumously crown his dead grandmother an empress, and have her remains carried back across the hills to rest beside the husband who had spent her entire life pretending she didn't matter. When archaeologists lifted that 3rd coffin's lid in 1957, they were looking at the physical remains of an apology that had arrived 9 years too late to matter to the woman it was meant for. Then came the disaster, and it came in 2 separate waves. 1950s. China simply did not possess the conservation science required to protect what it had just unsealed. Bolts of imperial silk, brilliant and vivid the moment the burial chests were first opened, darkened and turned stiff within days of exposure to open air. Attempts to treat the fabric with whatever preservatives were available on hand reportedly made the damage worse, not better. Wooden objects warped and split apart. With no proper climate-controlled storage facility ready in time, priceless textiles and organic materials ended up sitting in ordinary rooms that couldn't hold a stable temperature or humidity. And materials that had survived 337 years sealed inside an airtight vault deteriorated within a handful of seasons back in the modern world. Then, in 1966, the second wave arrived, and it had nothing to do with careless science at all. The Cultural Revolution swept across China, a nationwide campaign to annihilate every trace of the old world's customs and culture, and the tomb's own museum, a shrine built around a feudal emperor, made an irresistible political target. Red Guards physically dragged the actual skeletons of Wan Li and his two empresses out of storage, laid them out in front of a jeering crowd, publicly denounced 400-year-old dead people as criminals of the old order, and burned them completely. Every single forensic question modern science hadn't even thought to ask yet in 1958 became permanently, irreversibly unanswerable in that one afternoon. That specific fire is the exact reason China quietly made a rule that still governs its archaeology today. No emperor's tomb gets opened on purpose ever again. Only rescue digs, and only when looters, construction crews, or natural collapse have already broken the seal first, leaving science no other honest choice but to step in afterward. Which is precisely how the third tomb got found at all. 1971, a work crew digging an ordinary air raid shelter near Changsha strikes gas that burns with a strange colored flame the instant it touches an open torch. An old local sign that experienced gravediggers in the region had long understood to mean a sealed, undisturbed ancient tomb was sitting somewhere directly underneath. Archaeologists dig down some 50 feet and eventually pull out a woman who has been dead for 21 centuries, and by every reasonable expectation of decomposition, simply should not exist anymore in any recognizable form. Her skin is still soft and moist to the touch. Her joints still bend normally when technicians move her limbs. Her eyelashes remain intact. Her fingerprints are still distinct enough to be formally recorded. When physicians performed a complete autopsy in December 1972, opening her body exactly like any modern hospital procedure, they found every internal organ still in place, shrunken but whole, right down to nerve fibers as fine as thread, and enough blood remaining in her veins to determine her blood type. Her arteries showed severe, dangerous plaque buildup. Doctors found blood clots consistent with a heart attack, multiple gallstones, one lodged painfully in her bile duct, and a damaged, fused disc in her spine that would have made simply standing agonizing. And packed inside her stomach and intestines, pathologists counted 138 completely undigested musk melon seeds. Melon passes through the human digestive system within a matter of hours. She ate a melon, seeds and all, and died within that same short window on the exact summer afternoon researchers could pinpoint down to the season in a level of forensic detail that no pharaoh, no Roman emperor, no medieval king anywhere in recorded history has ever been given. This is Lady Dai, wife of a regional chancellor named Li Kang, who served a semi-independent kingdom within the early Han Empire, wealthy and powerful within her own province, but well below the level of the imperial family itself. Her tomb was stocked like an entire manor house, transported into the afterlife. More than 1,000 objects, lacquered dinnerware, cosmetics cases, musical instruments, silk gowns of a fineness, modern weavers have genuinely struggled to reproduce, even with contemporary equipment. And to this day, nobody has fully explained why her body specifically survived when other tombs sealed using the exact same nested coffin, charcoal-packed, airtight method produced nothing at all but bare, ordinary bone. Right next door to her tomb sat her sons, and inside it waited a buried library, sealed shut since 168 BCE, that ended up rewriting what scholars thought they already knew about one of the single most read books on the entire planet. Researchers found 2 complete copies of the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism, older by centuries than any version anyone had ever previously laid eyes on, and both copies present the book's 2 core halves in the exact reverse order from every single traditional edition read continuously for the past 2,000 years. A text studied by billions of readers across 100 generations turned out to differ meaningfully from its own oldest surviving copy, and scholars are still actively arguing today about which version actually sits closer to the original intent. Alongside it, set detailed regional maps drawn to a recognizable, accurate scale among the oldest surviving maps anywhere in China, and a silk atlas cataloging 29 separate comets, each one illustrated with its own distinct tail shape, compiled centuries before anything comparable exists anywhere else on Earth. Fourth tomb, and this one reaches back 3,000 years, well past any written proof at all, into territory most Western historians had already quietly filed away as outright legend. In the late 1800s, farmers working fields near the city of Anyang kept digging up ancient bones and grinding them into powder, selling them by the basket in local pharmacies as a folk medicine called dragon bones. In 1899, a scholar and collector in Beijing actually stopped to examine some of these bones closely before they could be crushed, and noticed the scratches covering them were far too regular, far too deliberate to be natural wear. Those scratches turned out to be writing, an entire script older than any Chinese text then known to exist. And at the time, not a single living person on the planet could read it. Decades of careful decipherment eventually revealed these were the actual royal archives of the Shang dynasty, a semi-legendary royal house that many modern historians, particularly in the West, had long since dismissed as pure myth with no real evidence behind it whatsoever, roughly the same skeptical treatment given to the kings described in Homer. Among the tens of thousands of these oracle bones recovered from the fields around Anyang, one specific name appears by common scholarly count in roughly 200 separate inscriptions: Fuhao. The king asks the ancestors about her pregnancies and her illnesses, a husband's private worries. He also asks, astonishingly, about her military campaigns, one famous bone describing her personally mustering as many as 13,000 troops and leading them directly against enemies threatening the Shang borders. Other bones show her presiding over the state's most sacred sacrificial rituals, duties that were, by every other surviving record, reserved strictly for the king himself. Read together, the archive describes a woman who was simultaneously a general and a high priestess, arguably the single most powerful woman anywhere in the entire Chinese Bronze Age. And for most of an entire century of modern scholarship, that's all she ever was. A name scratched into a brittle bone. No tomb, no object, no image. Nothing at all outside the divination texts to actually prove she had ever walked the earth in the first place. Then, on the morning of May 16, 1976, an archaeologist named Zheng Zhenxiang, the first woman archaeologist of the People's Republic, stood over a freshly pulled core sample at a site called Shaotun on the edge of the Anyang ruins and saw something that shouldn't have been there at all. The narrow probe, pulled up from a depth of roughly 26 feet, came back carrying damp red lacquer, the unmistakable residue of a decayed wooden coffin, along with a small carved jade pendant. Lacquer and jade together at that specific depth meant one thing, and one thing only: an intact, undisturbed elite burial at a site where absolutely every single royal tomb across 3,000 years of continuous looting had already been stripped down to its bare foundation walls. The dig turned into a genuine race against rising groundwater flooding the pit, artifacts hauled up bucket by bucket as the water climbed. What eventually came out of that modest, flooded hole was the single richest undisturbed burial ever recovered from the entire Shang civilization: 468 bronze objects totaling over 1.5 tons of metal, 755 carved jades, more than 500 bone objects, close to 7,000 cowrie shells functioning as currency, and 16 human beings sacrificed and buried alongside her. A grim but standard practice for Shang royalty of her rank. The identity arrived the moment the bronzes were properly cleaned. Cast directly into more than 100 of the ritual vessels was a single repeated name: Fuhao. She was real. Every scholar who had ever read the Oracle Archive recognized that name on sight, and everyone standing at Anyang that year understood immediately exactly what the match meant. The woman the king's own diviners had asked about for a century of scholarly debate, the general, the priestess, the powerful royal wife, was physically present in the ground, surrounded by precisely the tools of the exact life the ancient bones had always described. The archive said she led armies. The tomb held ceremonial bronze battle axes, cast with her own name, the specific emblem of military command that no ordinary consort would ever be buried carrying. The archive said she conducted the state's great sacrifices. The tomb held one of the most complete sets of ritual bronze vessels ever recovered from the entire Bronze Age. The bones were never myth-making. They were record-keeping, and one small, flooded, overlooked pit just proved it beyond any argument, restoring an entire vanished dynasty's credibility along with her. She survived intact for one specific, almost accidental reason. Every single king's tomb at Anyang, without exception, got looted down to bare walls across 3,000 years of continuous grave robbing, some of them repeatedly, across multiple separate centuries. But Fuhao wasn't buried in the royal cemetery among the kings, where her rank and reputation would seem to naturally place her. Her shaft was sunk near the palace district instead, apart from the great tombs entirely, possibly, some scholars suggest, so a grieving king could keep her close to where he lived and worked. Whatever the actual reason, that single placement fell completely outside the map that generations of tomb robbers had worked from for 3,000 straight years. The exact same neglect that placed a forgotten servant's coffin inside an emperor's chamber in reverse is precisely what kept a queen entirely untouched and intact, all the way into the modern world. One final door remains, and it's still shut today on purpose, and it happens to be the single greatest prize in this entire 100-year story. 1974. Farmers digging an ordinary well near Xi'an strike fragments of hard-fired clay that turn out to assemble into a life-sized human figure, and buried beneath those same fields sit an estimated 8,000 more of them, an entire terracotta army standing silent guard underground for 22 straight centuries. About a mile away from that buried army sits the actual target. All of it was built to protect, the sealed burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, the man who gave the country its very name. A historian, writing roughly a century after the emperor's death, described in vivid detail a chamber built by 700,000 laborers over decades, containing scale models of entire palaces, a ceiling inlaid with pearls to mimic the night sky, crossbows deliberately rigged to fire automatically at any intruder, and, most famously of all, an entire miniature landscape of the empire, in which China's great rivers were reproduced using flowing liquid mercury. For most of modern history, scholars read that specific passage exactly the way they once read the ancient lists of Shang kings, as pure embroidery, a storyteller's dramatic flourish that surely couldn't be literally true. Then, starting in the 1980s, researchers actually tested the soil directly above the burial mound and found mercury concentrations far beyond any natural background level, arranged in a pattern that some researchers argue loosely traces the actual geography of China's major rivers, with the strongest readings sitting roughly where the largest rivers would logically run. The tomb itself has never been opened, so every interpretation of that pattern stays deliberately cautious. But the plain, undeniable fact, remains remarkable enough entirely on its own. Something sealed inside that chamber is still actively leaking mercury through 100 feet of packed earth, 22 centuries after the door was closed. Exactly as an ancient historian said it would be, writing at a time when nobody could have possibly verified his own claim. China knows precisely, to the foot, exactly where its first emperor lies. The chamber has been fully mapped using remote sensing without moving a single stone. The ancient legend is now half confirmed by hard physical data. And the official answer, year after year, decade after decade, remains a firm, deliberate no. This is the fire of 1966, and the ruined silk of Dingling casting a very long shadow over every decision made since. The reasoning isn't sentiment. It's simple arithmetic. Silk, lacquer, paper, and pigment all begin changing. The instant sealed ancient air gets exchanged for open modern air, and a tomb this significant can only ever be opened exactly once. Whatever conservation science exists on that specific day becomes the only chance its contents will ever get, forever. The looters of 1928 couldn't restrain themselves for a single night. The archaeologists of the present generation have restrained themselves for over 50 years running, holding the door shut against their own overwhelming curiosity, which may honestly be the single most impressive act of scientific discipline in this entire 100-year story. 4 tombs, reached across an entire century, and every single one of them arrived in a laboratory's hands, purely by accident rather than by choice. A warlord's dynamite, a desperate wartime tunnel dug under cover of invasion, an air raid shelter crew hitting strange colored gas, a farmer's ordinary well. And every single time, without exception, what actually came out of the ground turned out to be more extraordinary, more complicated, and more human than the simple story it quietly replaced. The murdered emperor is a heavier, harder truth than the vague, century-old rumor ever was. The disabled, addicted emperor in constant physical pain is a far more difficult truth to sit with than the lazy caricature history had already settled on. And a real, physically verified queen, buried with her own personal battle axe and her own sacrificial bronzes, costs the world infinitely more than a legend ever could, because a legend, by its very nature, costs nothing at all to believe or disbelieve. She cost history an entire, fully realized life it had almost completely forgotten it ever lost, buried in plain sight the entire time, waiting 3,000 years for a single archaeologist's probe to finally, accidentally, pull it back into the light.